We warn you, remember, we're live, this is unrehearsed, and we're looking for your participation. We want to engage the students who are here in the audience, as well as those of you who are out in extension offices. So let me give you the call-in number, which we'll repeat, but for telephone call-ins, the number is 1-800-828-8554. As we begin this evening, we're going to work in 3 15-minute segments. Basically looking at Giza's early life, then her work, and finally her vision and the future that she wants to lay out in terms of her ideas, her work, and the work that needs to be done. As you listen and take part in this evening, think about the framework we used at Camp Ojakita, looking at Giza perhaps as if she were an institution, a youth organization. Listen for clues about her vision, about her mission. Think about her espoused values, about the assumptions she makes about young people, and also about the artifacts, the work, the pieces that she has left behind, and the pieces that she continues to work on. So that's part of the framework we will tie back into. On my right, Byron Schneider and Gisela Konopka, and Byron's going to begin with the interview.
Well, Giza, we welcome you here this evening to join with this group of people and people in other sites across the state. I get the opportunity to introduce Gisela Konopka, who was born 84 years ago in Berlin, Germany. She escaped Germany after a time in a concentration camp and after a period in her life when she was an active Nazi resistance fighter. She came to this country in the late 1940s, and after a time at the University of Pittsburgh, became a professor at the University of Minnesota in 1947, a professor of social work in 1947 until her retirement just recently. She's been very active since retirement, as many of you know. And we're happy to spend an evening of conversation with Giza. As Joyce has said, we're dividing this period of questions into 3 parts. And the first question really is, Giza, how did you get involved in youth work? How did this whole career begin? At any point you want to begin telling us about it.
Probably started very early, when I was very young, and you heard my age, so you know, I tell the youngsters always that I'm about 100 years old, so then they can remember that I have to look far back. But I will not start with that. I want to say something about now. For years and years and years now, I have felt that people don't look at adolescents as if they are people. They always think that it's a strange breed. To me, it's not a strange breed. I can talk with them like I talk with you, or with you, or with you, or somebody who's even older than I. That's my first point. They are people, and that's important to me. All right, how did I get into all that? First of all, I once was an adolescent myself, strange as it seems. And this is long year back in Germany, but it's a period before the Nazis, and if you remember what the Nazis were, this is the horror period in Germany. But before that time, there was a republic, and we were very idealistic youngsters. And very early, there was a whole movement which really I have never seen here. But it was many things that you are doing too with young people. Hiking and art and singing and meeting together, and especially, I must say, it was the most important part, I still think, of my life in many ways, because it opened up the doors to so much variety that isn't only here in this country. So at that time in Germany there wasn't as much variety racially, but so much variety in thinking and working, and I will not go into all the details. We were very idealistic. We thought we can make a much better world. We thought the adults were often very stupid. We were just as bad as any other youngster. We couldn't get along very well sometimes with them. So we had often fights with them. But we were very close to each other. We got a little older. This is starting at age 12. And I could tell you a lot of stories about that. But the time goes, and I'm about 18, and there's already the first rumbling of the horror of the Nazis coming. Now, we were very much interested in public life and very politically interested. And if anybody says they didn't know what the Nazis were all about, I always shake my head and say they must have been fast asleep when they were my age, because now remember, this is a long time ago. This is 1932, so it's far back, but we were beginning to see what was coming. And so we were starting to fight what we thought was a great, great danger for young people and older people, and I will not again go into details. But you have to know that we as young people felt we can stem the tide. We didn't, but we thought we could. And we were standing at the harbor and handed out leaflets, and we were feeling that we were sticking our heads out, and we were. To make it very short and very quick, and all this I can take hours to tell, the Nazis come to power. And the horror is that there is a whole movement of young people too. And I have seen that too. What can happen if one sows one, hate, because they lived and ate hate. But second, which I have always, all my life, what I call the cardinal sin. And that is that they felt superior because they were white and blonde and blue-eyed. Now, an awful lot of them were not white and blonde and blue-eyed, but they pretended they were. And everybody else was inferior. Everybody else was inferior. And it's a horror. To me, this whole business of race relations isn't something recent, isn't something that has happened yet. It happened in 1933. When people think that they persecuted Jews because there was a religion, had nothing to do with religion, I want you to know. Nothing. It was because it was, quote, an inferior race. Now, we were very young, and again, we said one has to stand up. And this is what I feel so strongly about, that young people stand up for things when they believe in something. They're not just putting their heads down. I have to admit, though, that we were about 18, 19, 20. We were very afraid of involving 14-year-olds. We said we cannot make them part of what we started then was the anti-Nazi movement. Because the horror was that when you are in that situation, you have to start to learn how to lie, to pretend. We did not want young people to learn that. I will not go into all the details of this. I can only tell you one thing that I tell often young people. Don't ever believe that it wasn't as bad as the books tell you. In the concentration camp, and I will not go into details, I've seen with my own eyes a person hunted to death, not killed with a gun, which seems bad enough, but hunted to death. Make that person run, jump, fall down, run again, until the blood spurted out of the lungs and the hands went like that, and the person died. This I saw as a young person, but the marvel of youth, and I believe that very strongly of young people, is that they can withstand if they have an ideal. And that's what I wish for all our young people, that they feel they stand for something. They can stand up. And they are very wonderful, and I like to read you one poem. You know, young people write beautiful poetry. This was written by my sister, who later was killed in the war, but she was then 19 or 20. And I like to read that poem because it tells you something about that youth movement. That we have tried, bear testimony, God. That we have tried and stood defeat and laughter. That we have worked until we won, and after have tried again, bear testimony, God. And when they grinned and spat and left us weeping, and left us all alone, and left no love, you who then must have seen us from above, bear testimony that we were not sleeping. Bear witness when the future judges God, that we were wide awake and worked and tried, and that we conquered even though we died. If you are there at all, bear witness, God. Now, this is something I have in my past, and I feel very strongly that when we work with young people, I don't want to work only with all the things they have done bad and all the terrible things that have happened to them and all the things that they can't do. I want to work with them so that they feel their strengths.
When you came to the United States with this tremendous experience in your background, did you know that you were going to go into social work? Did you believe?
No, not at all.
When you ended up in Pittsburgh and later at University of Minnesota, what did you think your career would be like?
I was very sure that I would continue scrubbing floors. That's what I have done for years, because I was in France, I was in Austria after the concentration camp. Poverty to me isn't, you know, unknown. I mean, I came to the United States with the one skirt and blouse that I had on my body, and that was it. And I was very sure that I would continue that, because that was all that was there. Good God, you don't want to know all the stories that I go. Well, people always say, how did you get into all that? There was somebody here who many years before had immigrated and was very active with Urban League for, what was it at that time? Women Voters, I think, I forgot. Anyhow, she said, Giza, you can't just sit there and do all these things. We'll try and find, there are meanwhile scholarships, and she said, how about social work? I said, social work? No, no, no. That's just, you know, people who look down on people, and, you know, I had bad experience with social work. And she says, no, there's something brand new coming up, and it's called social group work. And that is working with young people, and that is helping young people to become self-sufficient, and so on. That sounded terribly interesting to me. It was called really informal education, and I liked that. And it was 4-H and YWCA and all these kind of things. Now, to go very fast, they told me that there would be something in Pittsburgh, there would be some scholarships. My husband came later. He was, what do we call that? Well, something working in a factory. We had no money. So he was working in a factory, and I could do a little study. The exciting thing that I want to say right now to me has been that social group work, which unfortunately is very often forgotten nowadays in schools of social work, but it's coming up recently again, and it's coming into education very strongly, had a philosophy that got me very excited and still excites me very much. And that is that you don't have to say we are either collectivism or individualism. You know, that's coming up with Russia having fallen down, that we are either the one or the other. Or that you have to say that I only look at the individual or I look at the group. That's not necessary. Social group work combines the two, which I thought, to me, is the essence of youth work.
And your experience in Germany as a member of a youth movement had given you that kind of experience that led you to this.
That's right, but we didn't have it as clear. But I have to say something about that experience very quick, too. I worked, even at that time, when I was in about 20, in delinquency institutions. And it was an exciting time. This is before the Nazis. All these people, by the way, who did that were later killed. That was so exciting, because I still remember I worked in a delinquency institution where there were boys and girls together. That was unheard of. And every Saturday, they had dances. And the head of the institution was playing the banjo. That was great. I learned something. I tell you another thing I learned. He said once to me, my goodness, you want to work with delinquents and you can't dance? That's ridiculous. And I can't. I'm never good at it. So he said, yesterday they brought in, and I never forgot her name, Dingle. She is 19 years old, and she was found dancing naked with the sailors. You know, this is Hamburg. And she is an excellent dancer. she can become your teacher. And this is the way I learned how to work with delinquents. They are my teachers. I mean, what I don't know, they know. What, you know, they're people. Again, it's we. And that was very exciting. I could go one example after another because of, this is one of my wonderful experiences. I tell you one more. The lakes were frozen, and the boys were, to me, about 7 feet tall because I'm very short always. And the woman with whom I worked, who was the supervisor, was also short. And we walked across the lake. And one of the boy, or I should say men, said, boy, aren't you afraid to walk with us over the lake? We just take you over our shoulder and throw you down. And I thought, what will she, because she was in charge. I was just the assistant. What will she do? She looked at it and said, well, but you won't do it, will you?
And that ended there.
That ended there.
Yeah.
So I want you to know, I learned a lot before I came. But what it gave me in Pittsburgh was a sense of that I learned the reasons for this. That you can, first this idea of individual and the group, but I think there were other things. This is beginning of the war in Pittsburgh. I was enchanted because I didn't see white faces only. You know, I had known that, not known that. And it was wonderful. We had in my classes, there are still some of my very close friends that were Afro-American, at that time black, or whatever we called it. And, you know, when people think that the hymn of the American black is recent, we sang that at that time.
We shall overcome.
Yeah, that's right. We sang that in 1941.
Yep.
And
Keith, I want to interrupt you and say
Yeah.
that this is a good time to get, some questions from the group here or from our phone-in people. And we can keep talking, but I'd like to hear some questions. Those of you who are out in the field, 1-800-828-8554, like public radio. And anyone in the group here who has a question they'd like to address to Giza, please go right ahead and do it. Anything at the moment? Yes, Chris.
In your book, I noticed there were several instances where parents were making decisions for their children that weren't very good decisions. Mm-hmm. How do you feel about that? And what should the parents' rights to make decisions about their children be, as opposed to other people being involved or the children themselves making decisions?
there's no general answer that I can give to that. Parents have sometimes to make decisions for their children. To me, the basis is we would have good families if we simply say, you respect each other. That means when parents say, the kids don't respect me, I say, do you respect the kids? Now, that doesn't mean that the kids always make the decision, because we can make very stupid, if you want to, I can take the next hour telling the stupid decisions I have made in my life. Oh, no, I mean, I better not do that. The point is, no, it's the question again of working together. I must say that when I came to the United States and started working in youth work, I found it interesting that there were adults who worked well with young people, with mutual respect. You wanted more questions, I'm sure.
Do we have any?
Come on.
Come on. Joe.
You mentioned about how young people need to know where they stand or what they stand for. You were talking about when you were growing up. How do you see that today?
We come into something that he will probably want me to say at the end, but if you don't mind, I'll say it now. To me, young people, just like any other person, wants to be somebody and wants to be respected as somebody. If we can help as youth workers to ingrain that in some sense that they become more aware of it, you know, more conscious of it, and to say, that's what you want, that's what everybody else wants. So let's work together on some of those things. I think we would move away from this stupid, you know, I'm better than you, for all kinds of reasons. I recently talked with a 12-year-old who did some pretty serious cheating because you can't wear a blouse 2 days in a row and she needs the money. You know? You see what I'm saying? Now, I think there is some working with this youngster of saying, I know, but why do you have to be like everybody, that you can't wear a blouse 2 days in a row, right? What I'm saying perhaps, and I think I should be clearer perhaps, is there are issues, and I still think they come always back to the respect for each other. But one can take little pieces of it. For instance, stand up for that, but what does it mean if the big boy hits all the little ones? You know, it's not only the race relation, it's also the other things. Or, I remember many, many years later, and I might talk about that, when I went back in 50 and 51 to Germany to help people to get away from this horrible race and inferiority thing. There was a woman who told us at that time children were born without arms. I forget the drug. Yeah, thalidomide, that did that. And she said, you know, in our area, they all wanted to segregate those children. Don't have them together with others. And she said, I brought these young people all together. And when you throw a ball, you can have a kid without arms sitting right in front of you, right? You are his arms. And his body catches this. And so it's in that area that this fabulous person was working on this business of mutual respect. To me, that is the base of youth work. I will say one more thing on that. When you ask for what you stand, you can also stand for beauty in the world instead of only all the ugliness. We don't have to. So many of our young people come from such ugly environment. Now we can help them to make beauty. You can make beauty out of very simple things. That leads me into a whole other area where I think art, music, dance, all this should be part of youth work. I'm talking too long.
No,
that's very good. Jerry.
Well, what you said kind of triggered something for me. It's rather than always taking them out of their environment and saying we're going to put you someplace that's beautiful, then we can help you to make your place beautiful. And I know that's something we're trying to work on in a couple of areas in Minneapolis.
So that resonates with you.
Yeah, it really does. I think that's really important because there is beauty in those places. It's just it needs to be looked at in a different way.
And it can be done. My husband and I, when we finally got a house here, and it was a broken down place, and I will not go into all that detail, but everybody said, well, how do you, well, we cut out of the newspapers beautiful pictures, and that's the way we had them.
We've got a phone call, Giza. Carrie in Owatonna. Carrie, can you hear us? Yeah. Speak away. Carrie, you're on.
Hello, good evening. Great to be on the phone here talking to you guys live. Gisela, I have a couple of questions, and one is that you started your youth work in the 40s where it seemed like the whole world was changing, and today it seems like the kids are experiencing a lot of changes as well. Is the world this really changed much, or is there parallels between the 40s when you started your youth work and today?
Did you hear that?
No.
Thanks, Carrie. The question was that you began your youth work in a time when the world was in a great deal of change. And people talk about the great deal of change right now. Do you see parallels between this day and the kinds of changes you experienced when you were younger? Or is this new and different change? Many parallels.
Many parallels, but also differences, naturally. I think in this country, fortunately, it isn't yet like when we had to fight the Nazis, where we were fighting inhuman forces. It meant death, really, every time. That some have that, but not everybody has that here. But the big changes, I think the changes that kids are exposed to are technology. Very, you know, suddenly everything, but I'm hesitating when I say that, because I think sometimes we have gone through a lot of technology changes too. I have still lived through a time when we didn't have electricity. So, you know, that's also a big change. There's something else. Somebody,
No.
No, but there are parallels, but I would have to hear more what the youth workers see as they themselves as a great problem in terms of the change. Because let me say that, the young themselves don't think that they're in the middle of a lot of change. It's usually the older ones that think there's such a change. And when I talk with parents in churches, I always say it's not that much change. What young people want, they want to be heard, they want to talk with you. It's not that much change.
David.
One of the changes that I hear a lot of talk about is the absence of the family and the change in the structure of the family. And as I read your book, I was struck by the strength of the family and the importance of the family, but also how necessary it was to have some other people around, because, like Chris said, often the family failed in the best interests. And I'd like you to respond to that as one of the changes that we think is going on now, but maybe have longer.
Well, first of all, I think that people always talk about the good old times, which weren't so good anymore.
Right.
And not all families were so wonderful. Don't tell me, did they ever read David Copperfield? I mean, the way the kids were running in the streets and all that, this is even before my time. Just think how long ago that was. And no, they were not all wonderful families. I remember one girl in my youth group where, I myself was then a teenager, who came crying and crying. What's the matter? She'll never talk to her father again. She found out he had gone to prostitutes. These were middle income. Oh, well, no, this isn't. That's my first point. Don't tell me that the family was so hot everywhere. It wasn't. There is some change in the total, I hope. In fact, that's the one good thing I see. Awareness that we are believing more that there isn't always one person who's the head and everybody has to kneel down. I'm an old historian. Actually, that's where I come from originally, from being a historian. I always say we all, regardless, frankly, from whatever area of the world we come from highly, what I call monarchistic units. I mean, either it was an emperor or something like that, or the top chief or something like that. That is changing. In a democratic society, you don't expect it, that the one person is the hot one. That showed in the family, right? When my father said he believed that, then he could hit us, because we're supposed to believe that, but we just still didn't. Huh? There's a change. Now, and we don't want it. I think we sometimes forget in youth work that we have to either accept or reject the idea that we live in a democracy and want to educate people for it, which means not doing what you want to do. That's wrong. That's not an interpretation. But helping each other and being very concerned with what the other one is.
When I talked with you about this question, and I do want to get my question in before we break for a second,
All right.
Because it deals with family. You taught me a phrase, a German word, Wahlverwandtschaften, and it introduced a new concept to me, a new idea. I wish you'd just take for a moment and ask them if they know what that phrase means, as you explained it to me.
Why should they?
But they shouldn't know what it means in German, but there is a time...
What it is. Let me explain. I feel very strongly that we sometimes are so sentimental about that it has to be the family into which you are born. I wish that that's the most wonderful unit, but it isn't always. Yet one has the wonderful opportunity to reach out to others. And that was in the 17th century, a poet called it Wahlverwandtschaften, relatives by choice. And I think I would like young people to know that in our institutions sit so many children who feel so inferior because we say, you know, you have to have your own family. but let's open them towards the adults who work with young people. I find this most exciting. Reuben Hill, who was a sociologist here, who taught me something else. He said, you know, Americans forget that not so terribly long ago, there were practically no grandparents around because people immigrated. And then think of the horror that we exposed black people to. Our Afro-American people weren't even allowed to have families, right? They took the families away from them. Now, when we make people feel inferior, then they sit there and say, oh dear, what happens to me? I poor thing, I don't have it. Instead of saying, choose, there's somebody, and they will be your, not always your father, your mother, but maybe your best friend. I have to tell you, there isn't a relative, no, that's not true. I have one relative in San Diego, but otherwise, there are no relatives around me, and I have friends, and I feel good. So that is good that you brought that in.
I think it raises, it's an old concept which fits today. Now, Joyce.
All right. We're going to take a break now, come back on at 7:10. For those of you who are here in the studio and also out in the classrooms and the extension offices, is you take a break, do a little bit of discussing about the issue, reflecting on our framework. What about Giza's basic assumptions about young people? What about her espoused values? What about the kind of artifacts of her work? Think about the stories that she told and what they tell us about her. So I've got 7:02. We'll be back at 7:10. Thank you.
I have to say something about taking the pictures. You said you cut out pictures to make like wallpaper or whatever.
Welcome back. We're going to begin again with an interview segment. Byron addressing some questions to Giza, and in about 12 minutes we'll pull back our question format.
Well, I wanted to refer to the years that you spent here at Minnesota after the late 1940s. First of all, I wanted to comment that I've been to your home, and I saw the home that you and Paul built, and how you made a beautiful place out of a place that wasn't so beautiful in the beginning. From the second floor office that Giza works in, one can look out over Lake Calhoun, and that was not always a window. Until Paul and you decided to create something beautiful there.
All handmade.
Now, bring us to the time when you come to the University of Minnesota and group work, this idea that you defined earlier for us. This is a relatively new idea in social work. It was an idea that you brought along to Minnesota.
No.
Not true?
I'm not the only one. No, I never take credit for something that I haven't done. First, I have to say, I didn't come right away to Minnesota. You know, when I came to the United States, I was several years in Pittsburgh. I not only studied, I was working at child guidance with kids who had great troubles, and don't tell me that, again, that's only recently. And this is during the war years, and these are children and adolescents, and I can tell you there are stories and stories that I can tell you about the slums in Pittsburgh. So I worked with that in the child guidance clinic. And it was only in so I was in Pittsburgh from 41 to 47. 47 I came to the University of Minnesota.
And what idea was in your mind
No,
about?
I repeat, what I wanted was to teach social group work, but that isn't that I invented it. I had learned it, meanwhile, as a student at the University of Pittsburgh. And Gertrude Wilson, Grace Coyle, these are names that should be known to youth workers, had written wonderful books. There were very few books in group work. We had to work mostly from our own records. There were hardly any books available. But they had developed this approach to youth work and to working with groups that I described. They had really developed that. And I got very excited about it. And when I came to, I'm jumping, when I came to Minnesota, I started immediately to teach. There were only, I think, 4 students in group work, but it went by leaps and bounds because really people wanted that and were most interested in it.
Giza, could
But,
I interrupt?
yeah?
When you say group work, often today, that really means therapeutic.
Nothing. Yeah, okay.
And that's not what you mean,
No.
is it?
Okay, let me explain once more. Social group work, the core of it I named, right, is a philosophy, not a little dumb technique, not something you say you do this and this and this and that. It's understanding people and seeing that one develops an individual while at the same time one helps that individual to become a giver, to
And
help
part of
other
the group.
people, of others, a group. At that time, social group work was part of social work training in the graduate schools, and it was mostly related to youth serving organizations, settlement houses, 4-H, the Ys. Remember the YWCA, most people don't know that, was one of the first organizations that really stood loud and straight for interracial work, as it was called at that time. And so that, and then also therapeutic. Yes, I am guilty. I brought it into child guidance work, which at that time dealt with kids who had emotional difficulties. I never thought that that was anything different from anybody else. Many, many years later, we had a project at the Center for Youth Development and Research where we worked with about, well, first we interviewed 200 girls, and that's the book that, 1,000 girls that we interviewed. But we selected all, at that time, the youth-serving organizations that worked with girls because they felt the greatest needs. This is later. And I remember purposely we put together 4-H, YW, settlement houses, campfire, and so on, plus always a few people from the delinquency institutions, because we felt, again, we had separated that too much. But there is therapeutic work. But you know, they always want to do group therapy because that had a higher status. And I always laughed, you know, it was always the idea, if you do therapy, you're something better than when you work. So, I'm sorry, as I say, I feel guilty because I started it in those settings, always saying, it's exciting. I had students in mental hospitals who taught people in mental hospitals at that time that you don't have people just sitting around the walls, staring into space until the psychiatrist comes to interview somebody, but you do something with them. You make music. I mean, just, for instance, one part of social group work was to understand what we called program, to understand content, art, drama, all these kind of things. But I will not talk now on social group work only, but I did come to teach social group work, and this is what I started. My first year at the university, I said, I can't teach, I'm not made that way, without what I call touching soil. I must do some direct work. I just can't do it. At the university, that's not very easy. You know, you can't do very easily direct work. But I always thought I could cheat it out by saying I do research. Now, that's unfair to call it that way. But the very second year, I got the permission for the summer to study group relations and working with groups at Red Wing, which is maybe a name to you that was, at that time, it was the Boys Delinquency Institution. And I spent 4 months living there. I lived with them. That means I didn't live in their cottage. I lived in that big house. But I did that, and it was exciting. And if any one of you is interested in history, this was my first book. I wrote simply records, told what I was doing with those youngsters, sitting around, playing, talking, and also what meaning it had, how the groups developed, and so on. And I had also the records from the Child Guidance Clinic. There was a very generous faculty member, they don't come very often like that, who found that she liked what I had written. She took it to a publisher. I had no idea. And it was a secret, and I suddenly was called in and they said they want to make it a book. This is my first book. It's called Therapeutic Group Work with Children. There's the word therapy. Therapeutic, but you can read it, and it was wonderful. I was sitting with does any one of you know Red Wing? You sit up on the bluffs with the boys, and I still remember somebody said, my God, will you not run when you are just playing? You know, we were playing ball, talking, and one of the boys said, not while she is around. I can tell you, the point is, you just don't act as, no, I was younger, but you don't act as if you are. As a youth worker, you don't act like this, you know. You are part of it. Without that, you are the same. You can't be the same, but you are part of it. For instance, I remember one day the boys sitting around the table, you know. I said, so what's so funny? I like to know too. We talked last night how old you are. I said, well, what did you decide? Well, we were not very sure whether you were under 16 or over 16. And I said, for God's sake, double it and go. And I think I was at that time 37. But I never forget, the kids looked at me and one of them said, oh, my God, she's as old as my mother. That led into the most exciting discussion about old people, you know, being that old. And there are many things in group work that I had to teach, that you don't always hit down on a youngster when they are difficult. That you
Tell us
will not
about how the Center for Youth Development and Research began.
All right. This is a long time teaching that, but I have to say one additional before the center comes. This is the times of the 50s and 51. The war ends. I have to say that very quick. I'm asked to go back to Germany to reestablish youth services and good delinquency services. Some of my friends thought you are crazy to go back in a place where they incarcerated you and looked down on you, and I said, you never punish one generation for what the other generation has done. And I feel that way very strongly. I will never generalize. So I just want to say I did that. But at the same time, my writing became more volume, more. So I want to just say before the center that I was really all over the world, in almost every country. At that time, mostly with that kind of focus, people wanted from me. How do you work with our young people? I can tell you, in Iran, which is before Khomeini, on the truck, I have a tape, I think, where we all sing together. And that were discussions like that. I remember in Thailand, a young woman who later wrote to me, we thought that the adults were impossible to work with. But when we finally start talking with them, finally we could even be able to even work with them. This came from Thailand. And so, I mean, I just want to say that. So I have to say, I will never, ever say that everything is only in the United States or only in Germany. You know, I've seen it in Egypt, in Israel, in Thailand, in India is my love, and I have seen horrible things that are happening to people, right? And children, when we talk about we do to children, I think what I have seen, I remember one time at night when we had to drive to the airport. Both, my husband at that time went with me, we looked at each other and we were totally amazed because both of us were crying. Because all around us were naked, filthy children, you know, leaning against cows and so on. Just want to say, youth work is difficult everywhere and one has to know it all across the world. Now, he asked about the Center for Youth Development. Time is going. I have to admit that I didn't feel satisfied with everything that was taught in the regular curriculum. And I also am still, even today, somebody who likes to have a lot of contacts with many other departments. I didn't want to be, I cannot be put in a box. And especially when I think of working with people, younger and old, but especially with the young, I want to open the doors. And that includes you have to know something about physics and about the art and the theater and everything. And I wanted to work with that variety. And at that time, I felt very strongly that we were totally neglecting adolescents. I have to say that. I still feel bad about that. It was always, oh my God, my child will soon be an adolescent, one of the fathers said, and I wish I could take them and put them in a refrigerator and take them out when they are 22. And this is my favorite start of every speech I give on adolescence, because it's so horrible, the total disregard of that age group. So I felt this is maybe the common thing that will bring all these different departments together and get interested in developing more youth workers, but not only that, really working with it. Now, the university at that time also started a Center for Urban and Regional Affairs, and they made me one of the first coordinators, which allowed me to take people from history or wherever it was and dump them into the one of the real bad areas. I still remember of St. Paul, where we had a storefront. You know, I got very involved with all those things, which was wonderful. But the center, the base of the center, was a focus on adolescents and a focus on interdepartmental work. I want to underline that. The hope that we will not all be just so close, you know, this, looking at that.
I want to see if there's some questions. Questions here in the electronic classroom, or any of you who are out there calling 1-800-828-8554.
When you said you interviewed 1,000 girls and you started to say about that book, when was that?
God, I have to look up the year. You know, it's about 1974, 1975.
Okay. I'm very interested in gender equity in adolescence. And it seems like an awful lot of the new research coming out, and maybe it's not that new, is saying that young girls, especially in early adolescence, lose 50% of their self-esteem and never get it back again, or struggle in adulthood for that. And what happens? I mean, what can we do for young...
I love the question.
Female
Get
adolescents.
that question. First of all, I don't trust that research.
Okay.
What does it mean you lose your self-respect? In adolescence, everybody wavers. If the boys pretend that they are something, it's pretense. This is the period where you are doubting. There are other periods you're doubting too, but that is part of adolescence, and it is somebody else there. I'll quick answer that though. And can I
no, go ahead and finish.
Okay.
Mary's calling from Two Harbors, but let's wait and finish this question and we'll take the next one.
So first of all, when I always say to people, no, naturally we doubt ourselves. That's quite clear. Now, there are some additional things. If we put an enormous emphasis on the way we look, This is stronger with the girls, usually, than with the boys. But some of you are men here, and you can tell me, I have found boys who are short and very slim in adolescence. They are just as desperate and have a loss of self-respect because they think everybody has to be, 6 feet. So, that exists too. But it is true. We make more fuss about the way a girl looks, and that does something. I think that very often there is this idea that sometimes hangs over from other times in some families, that you shouldn't, when you are a girl, you should always be nice. You mustn't stand up, All these are things that, and when you talk about youth work, I don't believe in saying, I have seen a program and I was shocked when they all sit around and say, I have self-respect, I have self-respect, I have self-respect. That's to me foolish. It's not the way you're getting it. But you let them do things that they can do well.
Yes. And provide that opportunity.
Exactly. That's right. You apply lots of opportunities. And I could go on, but you want to.
Mary, do you
Yes.
hear me? You
Hi.
want to call?
Yes.
We can hear you.
Okay, great. We have 3 people here in Two Harbors, and we had a couple of questions. They're unrelated, so should I just ask them both and then?
Yes. Why
Okay.
don't you ask them both, and then then you can hang up, and Giza will answer them.
Okay, that sounds great. One of them has to do with social group work, Gisela, and you were talking about social group work was working so well and had lots and lots of potential. So one of our questions was, why do you think that social group work isn't happening as much anymore, or what's different now, or what has happened over the years?
Okay.
And then our next question is, Gisela, you talked a lot about when you were 18, adolescents and young people thought that they could really make a difference. And one question that we have is, do you think that today young people think that they can make that same kind of difference? And what is our role, to talk more about what our role is as youth workers or adults in that situation?
Good question. Thank you, Mary.
Yep.
The first one.
Yeah, I understood it.
Why not so much group work?
Well, part of it, I think, had to do with the need of social work to gain a lot of status. And the feeling was that working, within the streets and so on, and in delinquency institutions doesn't give you much status. That's the way I see it. And the other thing, the one-to-one, was much higher value. This is, by the way, I'm very pleased. The world goes always around and around, and I see a big change. There's a big organization. It's international. They'll have a big meeting. I am supposed to speak again. I say, my God, I'll repeat myself. Don't matter. We are younger, we don't know. So it's all coming back again. But I think it has to do. I think there's another point that I have, that is my personal point, that I think it was perhaps wrong that it was only taught in social work. I would like it to be taught in social work and in education without question. That belongs there. Okay, that's one. Now, your other question was...
What's our role in helping young people make a difference? And do you think young people feel they can make a difference today?
Yeah. It's harder. I admit that. And that's the one time where I see a change. And it has to do with the public media. See, we could only talk to each other. Then you do something. But now you observe all the time. You look at something. You are really can be much more satisfied to just sit and watch. I think that makes a difference. I don't think television is bad. I only say it changes something. We have to think of not counteracting it, but taking it in. I have thought a lot about that, because we have now, young people can sit for hours. I know an intelligent 9-year-old, that's before adolescent, who the parents have said, now we take that television out of. And she said, then I have nothing to do, and she went to bed. It's an intelligent kid. But I think there is something about that. So how do we do that? Well, first, I think including television by, for instance, when I would work today, and I don't, with some youth groups, I would look at some programs and suggest that we look at them together and talk about them. It's a long, I haven't seen it for a while, but there's one that struck me like that. You probably know it better than I. It was something about I Fly Away.
I'll Fly Away.
What?
Fly Away.
I'll Fly Away. That's the name of the program.
I thought that was
It's a
one.
great program.
You think so?
Yeah,
too?
very good.
Because I thought if I would have a bunch of group, I would say, either we do it
Very good.
together or tell me about it, and then talk about it. Not always saying, this is only right, this is only wrong, but have a discussion about things. That's taking television. I do think taking news, definitely. I want to know what they think about Nixon. I heard a lot when we did that survey. This is the time when he had to leave. Now there's some change. What's going on? Why does this happen? Look at the pros and cons. I like discussions that are serious with young people. We can do that. Now, to stand up for something, sometimes it can be very simple things, where they can be very active. When we did this project where we had these 10 agencies together,
Yes.
we always met for one day where they decided on some projects that they would work with the kids. And I have the most wonderful little booklet where that came to me, what they were doing. I'll give you one example. In one small town, I think they were Girl Scouts, but I might be wrong, the water in the river was very polluted, and the kids said you can't swim in it. The adults said it isn't so polluted, it doesn't matter. And anyhow, we can't do anything about it. The kids said, but it comes from somewhere. And the adults would say, you know, the mayor, everybody would stand against them. So these smart kids distributed to every household blue, what is it called, blue paint, and asked them to use it in their toilets. And on one day, you know, on a certain day, well, that river got blue. And they, if that isn't standing for something and show action, they proved to the city fathers, mothers, whatever they were, that they were right, that that thing was polluted by the way they had the sewers going. And that was changed. That's just one example. Sometimes I have heard wonderful things that are happening with some of our youth-serving organizations that do some excellent work. The environmental stuff is a little easier, a little safer, right? But for instance, I have seen young people, it's very dangerous. I would never suggest this going, you know, the well-dressed kids going to do it for the poor. No, not that kind of stuff. But to work together on something. You know, let's say, I don't know, a group from Medina working with a group from the north side on something together. That makes a difference, and that gives an idea of standing up for something. Also talking about it.
Talking about it.
Letting them see people who stood for something. We have a fabulous community, by the way. Many of the older people, I think, are not even looked at. But I'm very excited when they ask me to talk with a class, for instance. I like that. And then we talk about it, and I never tell just about my life. I say, what are you doing about making things better? And they like to think about that.
I think sometimes that the TV projects a scale that makes you think you have to do things that are so enormous instead of doing something like your example in your own community.
I'm so glad that you say that, because even I, almost 100 years old, at times feel totally desperate because I can't change the world, you know. And then I say, well, you have to do it at one spot. There's another thing. She asked how, if we always tell them that nothing can be done, then nothing will be done. I think we have to give them some hope to me, if I were working today with a youth group, I would cut everything out about South Africa. I mean, this is awe-inspiring. You know that that's possible. It won't be sweet and nice and anything, but just imagine 300 years. And this is happening. Boy, I would sit with those youngsters and cut it out of the paper, looked who is involved, the things that a person like Mandela says, the man who was 20 years in prison
27.
and was hitting hard rocks. That is, I mean, I have to tell you, my mouth always drops open when I read it. And I think young people get very excited. They have heroes.
The danger of the television is that young people, as old people, will become merely spectators.
That's right.
Yeah.
But there's tremendous potential for education and
That's
for
right.
action. There was, I dwell upon this question because you lived in an action-oriented time.
Yeah,
When
that's
your
true.
classmates, your young teenagers were out on the streets in ways that our kids, they were part of youth programs
That's right.
that we've never had the equivalent of in this country.
Well, but
the political
some are.
movement, the political youth organizations in this country were never as strong
No.
as they were, or the union organizations.
No.
You were
that's
part of a
true.
great union,
Yes, that's
social
right.
democratic movement.
That's right. But I have to say that I think some of the church groups here are an equivalent to that. I'm very surprised because, you know, I didn't belong to the church group, but I think some are very active, oriented, and can do it. I think I see some in the YWCA. I have seen it there more than in the YM, but there were some very good things that happened at the YMCA. I think 4-H at times has that kind of maybe another view. I mean, maybe they work on wetlands, you know.
Yeah.
No, I don't think it isn't there. I think just it can be strengthened. I think that's what we can do.
It seems to me that the media piece of it, too, suggests that somehow when you see it, I mean, if someone had captured on film and every family had been watching some of your actions, it might have been frightening, where to people in the community who
That's
knew
right.
you, they just knew it
Yeah.
was their young people.
Well, and they didn't like it either.
Oh, okay.
We had lots of fight. But that's again, it's not all the good old times.
Yeah.
But for instance, I think it's youth workers who have to explain young people. That's another thing. They don't only work with young people. They have to explain young people. For instance, let me give, we get into what we should do, but I feel, for instance, very strongly, every time I hear this, oh, there are these gangs, then I always say, now, wait a minute, I remember a song. Hey, hey, the gang's all here. Why is it right away a bad word? Oh, look what they do. I say, right. When they are becoming violent, I'll fight it too. But always remember that a gang in many ways also means finally some feeling of we, that one belongs somewhere. I interviewed one girl a few years ago in detention at Minneapolis, and she was so desperate. And I said, has never anybody been with you, you know, just went with you, was kind to you? She said, only in the streets, some. This is terrible. And I feel very strongly that it's the youth workers' role, besides working with the young people, listening to them, but also explaining them. Now, if I would have before me a violent gang, it's not that I would be for that. But always remember, they are not all, and everyone in them is not violent either. There are certain things that are happening, and one would have to work with them.
Just about 20 minutes. So I think maybe we want to turn that.
Why don't we take the hint from you, Giza, and look to what we can do in the future to move to that third question about the work that's yet to be done. Someone had already asked a question about changing family changing families. I don't know that we can change families, but what is the work for us, for youth workers, that still needs to be done?
Yeah, it's a big job. I'll name a few things that I think we can do. One is to allow Wahlverwandtschaften. To allow, that's partially the, what is it called? The not monitor, the other word. People are kind of being with a youngster. That can be a great help.
Mentor.
But mentor. I
Mentorship.
looked for the word,
Yeah.
I couldn't find it. Mentor. The mentor. I think that's one part of it. But I think the other thing, first of all, never, ever make youth work a gimmick. I'm scared to death of those gimmicks that are taught. You always sit in a circle and you say 1, 2, 3. No, you can sit in a circle. I like to sit in a circle. I don't mean that. But one, never a gimmick. The focus has to be on that these are human beings. The second is these are we. That doesn't mean that the group worker or the youth worker is the same. They can't be. They are adults. But they are human beings just like they, right? And they have to show that they understand when they are having difficulties. Recently I interviewed some kids in a home where they come because they are difficult. And when I sit alone with a kid, then I say to the boy who's 15 years old, I say, now tell me what hurts. He looked at me. He said, nobody ever asked me that. They always say, what have you done? You know. So that's the second thing that I think is important. I think, and that's difficult, I think youth needs outlet for adventure. It's a restless age. And my God, it becomes terribly tight. The world becomes so tight. You are not allowed to do anything. Everything is so highly organized. That's difficult. I think one needs a lot of imagination. Many years ago, and he is not more alive, unfortunately, I knew a probation officer who worked with delinquent kids, and what he did was make a raft with them. Is the word raft right?
Raft, yep.
Well, he said, first of all, they learned a lot of mathematics because they had to measure woods. And they made it. This was a hard job. Then, when it was all done, it was summer, and he said, we make that raft so that we can go down the Mississippi, because the Mississippi goes from Minneapolis so down to the strange land of New Orleans, right? Well, but on the way we will have to stop somewhere. What do we do? Well, well, we will write, and they decided to write to the police in every little place to fix it. You know, maybe we can't do all this. I can't judge right now whether we can do it quite that way, but I think it's probably possible if we do it with good supervision and so on. But it worked. Some of the kids that, from that trip, but from another trip that they had done with a woman at the north, came to a meeting, and I said, what was different? It's your probation officer that was with you. They said she was different. She was on the cookout with us. She was a person. Now, I think, but in everyday life, there has to be some excitement. Partially, I think, I believe, but that's my own interest, it's theater. It's very exciting to be somebody else than you really are. And to do that, that can be very exciting. But there are lots. Painting to me is very exciting. I think there are possibilities. Sometimes some give grants to an artist in, how do you call it, in residence, who then works with all these kids. It's very exciting. And I personally love poetry, and all my books, when you read them, are full of poetry of young people, and they write beautiful poetry. And if you make books out of those and maybe distribute them, or if you have exhibits, I only will start, I haven't yet started, to go out to one of our reservations, because I'm told that these kids go to neighboring schools where they are terribly discriminated against. Well, maybe if we could get some youth organizations, you know, nearby, who then can begin working with them in a different way. So I think it's outlets for adventure I consider terribly important. Two more points. One is participation. I always write very large. You can't just do programs only for them. Now, to say, what should we do today is stupid, because sometimes they have no idea what they should do. But to let them participate in thinking what kind of things would be interesting, what kind of thing. Doesn't mean we can always offer it, but participation, to me, is written very large. And the last one I want to say is what I said in the beginning, and that is respect. Now, just recently when I talked with some of the youth workers from one of the reservations, they said, oh, everybody is so mad because the young show no respect. What can we do? And I said, well, I can't give you any recipe, but there's only one basic principle I can give. If the older ones don't respect them, they'll never respect you. I mean, there's something about showing respect. And I end with a little story that always sits in my mind of the 1950-51, when I returned to Germany, you know, talking. It was horrible. I mean, what the delinquency institutions were, I cannot describe you, because they were really treated like they were dirt. But in one corner, and I was always talking with these youngsters, where these, again, they're always 3 times as tall as I am. But in German, when you talk with people over 18, you're supposed to call them Sie instead of du. That means something like thou instead of you, okay? But since they were inmates, they were always called you. And so I sit down with them and we talked, and I call them all Sie, okay? Or what did thou do, and so on. So one of them finally looks at me and says, you can't say thou to us. I said, why not? We are criminals. I said, you must have done something pretty bad, but you're still over 18. From then on, we could talk. Can you see what I'm saying? You have to give respect if you want to receive respect. Now, it isn't that simple. I don't say that youth work is simple, and if somebody would come and give me all the problems, I can't solve them all, but I can give some ideas. So these are the points I had in my mind.
Oh, no, thank you. Anybody comments? We just have a few minutes left. Also, if any of you out want to call in, go ahead. Oh, Julie.
This isn't so much of a comment as just a question. I'm really interested in any work you've done on reservations. I'm going to be spending 2.5 months on the Acoma and Laguna reservations this summer, and any experiences you might share with me as far as what it might be like. I've been working with city kids all my...
I don't have yet. I'm just starting. The first discussion I had when they told me all that was on the porch of my house. So I'm just going there. You know, have more experience than I have.
So you're both beginners on this one.
Yeah.
That's nice. Jerry.
You started to say something about not hitting down a child when they're difficult, and then another question came up and you didn't finish it, but the idea of coming down hard on a child when they're being extremely difficult. Could you maybe finish that?
I think each person is somewhat different, and we have to be ourselves. But I always think the moment we make a person feel down, then inside the anger mounts. It's like, you know, you do that, then this tries to go up. And that is the point. Now that doesn't mean you can be, I don't say you can always be sweetie pie. I don't mean that.
No, but it's like a power struggle. That's, I think, what you're talking about.
It's not necessary. Everybody always comes with the questions of when they become violent. Well, certainly you can't let them. Once I remember, this is years back in Red Wing, one of the kids took a big iron rod that was lying there, and then he went and was ready to hit anybody. Well, I put my arms around him, you know, like this, and held him. That is restraint without question. Mm-hmm. But there was no point in yelling at him. There was only, I still remember, I said, I will have to hold you as long as you keep that thing in your hand. Just drop it. Mm. And it was almost as if I was singing a lullaby. I still remember that. Drop it. Just drop it. That slowly dropped. No. It so happened he was a little thinner than I. But, you know, I don't mean that it always works that way. But I also, you know, Fritz Redl, whom you should read all, but nobody knows him anymore, has written a wonderful book many, many years ago on discipline. And I quickly end with that example, because it is a wonderful one. He said, when you are working with people, in general, it doesn't help that you become violent yourself. Certainly you will have to prevent violence. So, assume you are on a boat with 8 kids on the river, and one of them stands up and starts shaking, okay? And so you have to say, sit down. But the kid doesn't sit down, so you are hit him and sit on him. But don't think you have done anything good for him. You just have saved 7 other kids. But you haven't done anything good for him.
What was that last name?
R-E-D-L.
R-E-D-L.
And you will hardly get the books. They are all old books, but they are wonderful.
Fritz Redl did an introduction to one of Giza's books.
His was wonderful.
I was going to, if we had had a lot of time, I would have asked you about Edward Lindgren.
Yeah.
I would have asked you about your work with Diane Hedin.
Right.
Maybe I'll conclude at least my part of this program by saying how fortunate I've personally felt. I can remember when I was a high school principal having just an absolutely miserable day. For whatever reason, just an awful day. I'd have the opportunity, and it was first at the suggestion of Diane, to walk about 7 blocks from the school down to your house, where there was always a glass of orange juice and some cookies for me in the living room, which I also remember. And you would be able to say in 15 minutes all that I needed to hear about how my own conduct contributed to the problems which I was experiencing and that I was forcing on kids. And one of my great teachers, and how fortunate we are to have you here with us this evening.
Thank you.
We are.
And thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We will be off in a minute, but let me just remind you, we're together, all of us, at Seward School this weekend, 5 o'clock on Friday. We'll gather. Byron suggests that we go meet in the Matthews Park Center, which is the center right adjacent to the school. And you should have a map. If you don't, by any chance, if you call, again, Dolores at 625-3107, she can fax you one of those maps, one of the maps you drew. And take a look at this one, Adolescent Life and Ethos. And one of the things that occurred to me while while this conversation was going on is there are many ways in which this young woman who was the ethnographer at the school was a presence in the school very much like a youth worker might be. It really comes out in first and last chapters of the book. But think about that piece and bring this with you, as well as what, paper, anything else? Just so we're at school, we don't need anything special. And your brains, that's right. And we will finish up at 3 o'clock.
On Saturday.
3 o'clock on Saturday. All right, thank you. And thank you all for tuning in. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.
Is it appropriate to shout encore?
Shout encore?
Always.